Get ready for the Ochelli Effect. Most underrated voice in all media. The alternative's alternative. Chuck Ochelli.
21st day of June 2017, allegedly, according to that thing we call a calendar, and welcome to the summer solstice in some parts of the world. This is the Ochelli Effect, broadcast live from the facilities of Ochelli.com, but also heard on autonomous media and a few other platforms which do still have the guts to carry us. Anyway, we welcome you no matter how you're coming to the show. Maybe you're catching this later on down the stream by your fondle slab of choice, your applicable application, etc. No matter what it is, you are equally welcome. It is one of those interesting days. It seems as though I can't go by a day without calling it an interesting day anymore. There is a lot of action across this thing we call planet Earth, no matter what shape you think it is or whatever. Not here to have that debate tonight. It's Wednesday. Now, normally I have Mark Windows only for 1 hour, but tonight, Mark Windows, who is an interesting character in and of himself, windowsontheworld.net. Go check him out. He does quite a bit of a video presentation over there, which I really appreciate. Also, you can find him on YouTube, etc. And he has been here every Wednesday just about, with a couple of exceptions, recently, and certainly every Wednesday since we launched from Ochelli.com. So, it is something to behold when we take a look at the state of things. Now, there was an attack in Flint, Michigan earlier today. Yet again, another one of these stabbing attacks where allegedly someone has turned around and screamed something Islamic, initially in the melee, what have you. It seems to me as though there are unhinged individuals who are feeling the pressure of anxiety, which are choosing their motivations. It may be one day they're shooting up congressmen. It may be another day they've gone after, well, people that they think are Muslim. And it may be another day they're Muslims and they're going after people that they think are the enemy because, well, they've been propagandized, pressurized, and overworked one way or another. I think the most brilliant thing I have heard in the past 24 hours actually came out of the mouth of Mark Windows when I was listening to him do a show with the producer of this show. And he said, you know something, Tony? The paradigm is broken. I certainly agree with him, and I know we're going to elaborate on that. And we're also going to cover what is going on regarding this interesting fire, that tower, all of the events that are surrounding it. What does it actually mean? And here we go. Enough out of my mouth. Mark Windows, first of all, how you doing tonight, my brother from the other side of the Atlantic?
Well, Chuck, I'm very well, and actually sunburnt to the point where I'm bright red. In this country, what tends to happen is when the sun does come out, people sit in it for far too long because they're not used to it, and I've just become one of them.
Well, but you know what the bonus is? I love pale women. So Irish and English women who just aren't exposed to sun very often do maintain a rather pale tone to them. So, there I go, revealing part of my personality. And it is what it is. A lot of, yes, you could say that your typical native Englishman or typical native, Irishman or whatever from whichever island over there is often easily burnt when they do expose themselves to intense sunlight. So I can imagine you're kind of closer to the color of a lobster right now. or maybe
yes,
or maybe the color of Johnny, maybe even the color of Johnny Rotten's hair, just a bit off
Absolutely.
From that shade.
Well, when that was dyed years ago, when I I did that part in a film playing Johnny Rotten. It was actually orange, but I actually dyed it red after that. So you're pretty close. Yeah, but it's interesting because when I go to other countries which are extremely hot, I'm very careful. But here, you just go, oh, it doesn't matter. It's not going to last for long. It's not going to hurt. And actually, it did. But I was out in it for 4 days in the middle of a field. And the summer's taken a long time to come here. It's only just really arrived.
Well, yeah, and that's partially why I noted the summer solstice, because according to the calendar, depending on which calendar you're looking at, we have entered the season of summer in a lot of places, and it is a change. Now, what hasn't changed in my estimation, though, is the theater of politics and the manipulation of the culture / masses, and it is getting very, very disturbing from what I'm witnessing on this side of the Atlantic. I got to tell you, it's very hard for me to sort out this event where, a burning tower does capture the imagination of the average American post 9/11 reality, but there's a lot more to it than symbology. But then again, there is a great deal symbolic in the reality as well. So let's begin with kind of a recap on it. I mean, tell us what you've been able to discover, because it's just the disturbing event that continues to keep on giving, it seems like to me.
Well, really, this has exposed an agenda that's been going on here for many years, and it's really started to escalate over the past couple of years, called regeneration, which is, in other words, social cleansing or even social engineering. It all came out of Agenda 21, a UN initiative, which was really part of, originally, the environmental movement. The environmental movement became Agenda 21, Sustainable Development. 1992, Maurice Strong walked out at the Rio Earth Summit and said the present lifestyles of the affluent middle classes are not sustainable. And he gave a list of things that weren't sustainable, and most of them are the things that people used to think of as their rights. Now, the reason it ties into what's happening is because this tower was superficially clad, really, to hide it and its age and probably partly its grey decrepitude from the people who are moving into that borough. Because what's happening is the social cleansing is on such a large scale that new developments are being built all over London, and those people don't want to look at dirty old tower blocks. So I would suggest that the cladding that was put on there was merely superficial. It obviously wasn't fire retardant, clearly. So what's happened is it's exposed a massive agenda. And that is what is very interesting, because all this stuff that was hidden is now exposed in full view, and people can see what it really is. In other words, the local authorities and their supposed duties and liabilities to the residents of the borough are not being adhered to. And why are they not being adhered to? Because this is corporate governance. The council are merely carrying out orders from above. Everything's been sold off, and it's all done under global governance.
Now, interesting, because we discussed this exact thing last week on this show, where Agenda 21 is not merely this global conspiracy that one has to, extrapolate from the likes of the UN. I mean, yes, indeed, you can find it there, but this whole situation is absolutely a local concern, because your local councils, like you call them there, but we refer to them as town councils, municipalities, things like that over here. Same deal, though, doesn't matter which continent you're on. The fact is that these are being controlled by global concerns. They are not really your local representation, and we covered that. Now, some would say that in a state of being where buildings are run down because it's in a poor area, these kinds of things happen. But, I always notice a suspicious timing to these things. Usually there is some political upheaval that occurs, and then all of a sudden, I don't know, it seems like a mass tenement will be burned to the ground. And I am telling you about an American story, not an English story right now, but truthfully, it is the human story. It is the global story, because guess what? This is happening everywhere. And the local authorities, allegedly, and I'm holding up air quotes when I say authorities, are not really there to represent the local people. And it is a strange sort of concern. Now, am I making any sense to you, Mark?
Well, yes, you're just describing what's actually going on. Authority is becoming more and more remote, and people are being removed from the equation to react against it. So what you have is people who move into the area who will take up key positions, and they are not accountable. So that's what's happened here. The people there have now realized that this was merely a bit of a mistake that's happened, because the local authority has sold everything off. Now, this tower, I would suggest, was actually targeted for demolition, and the people in it wouldn't know that yet. So what they've done is superficially put this stuff all over it, not really thinking that it's going to go up in flames. So I don't think there's an evil conspiracy to the depth that it was done on purpose. But what we can say is that it's corporate manslaughter. I think we can safely say that, because if you clad a building with a substance which is not fire retardant, then there may be a raft of rules that have been broken. And that's the point. It's exposed what's happening, a superficial covering up of an agenda. And this has almost stripped away a layer of that agenda by this building going on fire. And of course, many people died in it. So this is a huge expose of what regeneration really is.
Well, and here's the interesting part about that, because some people might say to themselves, well, when you're talking about manslaughter, I mean, there's got to be some sort of intent there. What Mark is describing, to my satisfaction, is that the negligence which is involved in allowing places where people live to be treated in certain fashions, sort of not really caring about what the possible outcomes might be, not necessarily intentionally burning down a building, although that has been done in the past, but simply allowing the situation to decay so that it really doesn't matter what happens to those people. I mean, after all, the body counts, the individuals lost, the property, the alleged property lost by the alleged individuals that should be counted, that should be worth something, to their neighbors, et cetera, really are not a concern in the cost-benefit analysis of the greater corporation. So, not a big deal. If it burns down, it burns down. If it falls down, it falls down. It really doesn't matter. Well, it's actually done the developers a big favour, if you look at it from their point of view, because they can now demolish that and put something else in its place. These places aren't going to be refurbished for a very good reason, and the reason is that there's people in there who are in these council properties who may have lifelong tenancies. Lifelong tenancies cannot be taken away. They can only be replaced with assured tenancies, which remove many rights. And assured tenancies have lots and lots of stipulations in them where the resident, the tenant, the lessee can be thrown out. So what they've done in a lot of these places is they're pulling down all the council housing. This is why it's important. This is why this has highlighted what's around it, because 400,000 council tenants in London are to go, and many of them already have. So what they're doing is, by pulling down council estates, and they're going to pull them all down. So this is not just some isolated thing. This has highlighted what's going on underneath, as I stated before, that 400,000 are to lose their homes. Local businesses will be destroyed. There'll be no ballots or accountability. The cost of refurbishment is artificially inflated so that refurbishment is off the agenda. As I said, no lifelong tenancies will ever be issued again. People are on short-term tenancies now, which can be rescinded, taken away.
it breaches human rights by removal of people from their own area where they may have grown up. That's a breach of their human rights to live in a borough where they grew up. Now, voices are stifled. There's an artificial consensus put in. I've been to these meetings. I've seen what's going on. Bechtel and Lend-Lease are the preferred developers in many of the boroughs, and if they are not the preferred developers, they will be equally big corporates who come in and take over. So this is beyond social cleansing. It's the re-engineering of London as a city, and the re-engineering of cities in the UK is underway. And what we're going to see is very, very dense building. The reason that they're not refurbishing these council places that the councils give is that it's not really practicable. But what they're replacing them with are pretty much the same thing, but with more. So they wanted to build 58,000 new properties on these sites that these council estates have been. But they have had opposition, and this is what is worrying them. And this disaster that's happened is a huge embarrassment to them, and a possibility that the public can now really uncover what's going on, because it exposes the agenda completely.
Well, now, here's the thing, and I need to interrupt you here because I am noting that not all of the public is entirely fooled by this alleged consensus, right? It seems as though there are individuals who understand that there is a greater agenda at play here. They may not think that it's much beyond corporate greed and the more efficient use of space in order to create smaller tenements so that you can stack more of them on top of each other. So, listen, people are living in smaller little boxes. Hey, they do it in other countries, don't they? We've heard this before, haven't we?
Well, there's a bit more to it than that, because not only are they going to be living in little boxes, they're going to be living in little boxes with no property rights, and little boxes that are going to cost them most of their income, and little boxes which have no actual value and will probably be knocked down and replaced with other little boxes within 10 years. And that is the future of London. It's being turned into an elite city which is going to be for offshore investors. Many of those flats, up to 40% in the borough of Kensington and Chelsea, the new builds, are being bought by shelf companies and unoccupied. So what we're seeing in the central London boroughs is a lack of occupation of the properties.
So when you say shelf companies, is that the same thing when I'm talking about shell companies, where it's just like a fictitious company
absolutely.
That's there?
But most of them are in tax havens, and that's been proved by the new building which is on the River Thames. I think it's called Bankside, which was built near Vauxhall, if I'm right. I think that's the one, yes. And that's 40% foreign ownership, but also those people are never going to live there. So what we're seeing is not old housing stock knocked down to be replaced with better housing stock, which is the PR nonsense story. What we're seeing is people who are deemed not to be high earners and not highly taxable will be removed and are being removed.
And one would wonder where those people are supposed to go. What is the agenda there regarding where those people are supposed to go? I mean,
at the moment, they're just moving them out of London. The reason they're moving them out of London is because if they stayed there, they'd have a voice and may well get together. So this is, again, controlling the narrative. They're dispersing people to minimize protest.
Okay, well, I also posit another theory here, and you can call me on it and say, listen, because I know you don't like to theorize, but something is apparent to me here. A bunch of publicly spread events that involve terrorism, that involve the need for control on the streets by the, again, in air quotes, local authorities, preceded this. And I'm wondering if that's not just suspicious timing, or if maybe that's exactly what...
No, it's been factored in, Chuck. It's all part of the overall plan. Going back to 2011, a change agent group, which, for anybody who doesn't know what change agents are, they are people who implement change. Sounds a bit obvious, doesn't it? But they will not tell you what that change is, because they are mentored into the goals and objectives of Agenda 21 or Sustainable Development, and also the climate change agenda, the global taxation of the population and population reduction. They may not know every aspect of what they're enforcing. In fact, many of them don't. What they're doing is they are recruiting people with high esteem and low intelligence. And those people are being put into key positions. And I've seen this happen all over London and everywhere else in the UK. Whenever I go to a city or a village, these people are there. They are taking over and controlling the narrative. So in 2011, is to get back to your point, there was an announcement in Parliament, which I've linked to, and you can see it in an article called Big Society Change Agents and one called The Global Local Cabal. One of these change agent organizations who mentors social entrepreneurs, these aren't business people, these are social entrepreneurs. These are people who are going to affect other people with the agenda that's being brought in, the agenda of regeneration and all the rest of it, and all of these things we're talking about. So, this change agent group...
Wait just a second. Let me make sure I understand this, because I don't want you to just, you understand this thoroughly, so I want to make sure I got it.
Yeah, okay. Yeah.
What we're talking about when we're talking about these change agents are not necessarily people that are aware that they're in a depopulation deal, that they're working for the global government.
Right.
What they are is what I would call them is useful idiots who are implanted with the idea that, listen, you're going to make a positive change here. This is going to make things better for other people. So please go out and spread the word, because that's going to make you sort of a social hero. And there's your social entrepreneurialism, right? This is going to make you money because you have a position. You're now an important person. And if you're a useful idiot, this sounds like a pretty good deal. So you go out there and do it. But really what you're backing is something entirely different from what you're being told. So these guys are spread out. They're told, go out there and make these changes that they've been directed to make, supposedly for the better, greater good of all. And meanwhile, like I've said many a time, the concept of sustainable, something that is sustainable. Right? Sounds like, that sounds like a solid thing that you're building, and it seems like a good idea to make something that's a sustainable development. But really that's not what it means. Generally the terminology has been hijacked and twisted so that to the casual observer, this is all a positive effort. Am I following it pretty good so far?
Absolutely, that's a very good definition, and we've talked about this before. It's about the weaponization of language, it's about psychological subversion, and we've talked about the British Psychological Association, the Tavistock Institute, all of these think tanks where this stuff comes from. It comes into think tanks, into these groups, and everybody is talking a very limited and calculated, weaponized kind of language, which is really tempered by extreme political correctness.
Well, tempered by extreme political correctness, and then the atmosphere, which is produced by making a population believe that they are under siege, whether they actually are or not. One can make them sort of answer to the greater authority a lot easier, because, listen, they're there to protect you, right?
Absolutely. Let me just get back to that quote. It was stated in Parliament in 2011, and this goes into the idea of social unrest and how it was predicted. And the quote stated, "The result of the cuts," meaning these austerity cuts, "the result of the cuts will be one of anger, the degree of which is yet to be realized. The idea of the big society is to galvanize that energy before it takes hold." Now, what they're saying there is we need to stifle any upsurge in opposition, before it turns into social and civil unrest. So they knew this was going to happen. They knew that this was going to be extremely unpopular. So they've factored in many, many different ways of dealing with it. And one of those things was obviously to disenfranchise everybody. Now, when they talk about community, these ridiculous people come on who are paid a lot of money, who are called community leaders, and they spout crap about diversity and community. They're not from these places. I know this for a fact. After the Tottenham riots in 2011, a very well-mannered and highly educated chap called Nimza Bunji, who's an African, who looked like he was out of an episode of Star Trek, very chiseled features, very polite man. And I asked him very searching sort of questions, which he wasn't being asked by the mainstream media. And we were talking about the case of Mark Duggan, who was pulled out of his car, who was the catalyst to the riots in Tottenham. And he was a sort of mixed race man who lived locally, who was no angel, that's for sure, but had a gun. He was pulled out of a cab and there was a gun in a sock found 30 feet from him which didn't contain any of his DNA, yet it was his, of course. And that catalyst for the Tottenham riots. Now, this guy, I said, well, in your opinion, do you think the jury was led? And he goes, it's not mine to say. And I said, very diplomatic, and he laughed because he knew. But these people are brought in just to control the narrative. So when you see community leader, look at who they are. Have you ever seen them before? Very much doubt it.
Well, you know, it's fascinating to me because what we called a community organizer was allegedly our 44th president, and this is exactly the kind of thing you're talking about. And
yes,
it's, again,
actually, we've got those in the UK. We've got community organisers in the UK, and of course, all of this was done through Obama. But really, it was creating sort of citizen spies and all the rest of it. And it came out of Saul Alinsky's rules for radicals, which were openly quoted as being used by these organisations. But what they've done is taken Saul Alinsky one step further. So nothing is off the table. And if there is an enemy, you neutralise it. So these are military intelligence terms that are being brought in. They're neutralising the enemy.
The
Just
very
like
same
in that case the other day. You know,
right, and the very same terminology was used during COINTELPRO here to shut down those who were resistant to the greater program, you know, the drug programs and the various civil unrest dynamics that were played out in the U.S. in the early 70s. They would often talk about neutralizing these different individuals and groups. I mean, it's exactly that same speak. I mean, look, we are both speaking a very similar language, and our intelligence agencies do that too, don't they?
Well, of course, in military intelligence terms, neutralizing means killing them. In the terms that we're using, it could be just stifling someone at a debate. But really what it's about is bullying and victimization. And wait a minute, aren't these meant to be against the principles of these community organizers? Aren't they meant to be inclusive and diverse?
Well, but see, again, inclusion, diversity, this all sounds like positive terminology because, look, who doesn't want to build a community, right? Who doesn't want to see that no one is oppressed based on who they are? I mean, quite honestly, I'm the kind of guy who says that your ethnicity, your lineage is really unimportant because I'm more interested in your actions and your character, right? I don't care what, shade of skin you have and what God you pray to. All of these things are irrelevant to me when I take a look at your actions. So these are attractive terms to a guy like me, Mark, but they're, again, not really what they're saying. Right?
No, exactly. I mean, the thing is that it's interesting when they say about community, and there are people talking about it there. They've all been helping each other out. Another important point which doesn't seem to have been addressed is the fact that you've got a major disaster here. And And they're all saying on this, I was watching this Panorama documentary, which of course is the BBC, but they did let a few little things out, which is not usually what they do. But the interesting thing was that the people there were saying they all helped each other out. But as far as being a community, I mean, this is a totally ridiculous statement in London, because there aren't any communities. There aren't people who work on the land and know each other's families, and really support each other. There's people who may come together if there's a major disaster, but you don't have communities, so that is a fallacy. And the other thing about it is that they're destroying any idea of community. I know this for a fact because I've seen it close up. I've seen what's happening in North London with one of the only real venues which I have quite a connection with being absolutely victimised and destroyed, because they have things like punk rock concerts and people who really are outside the mainstream performing there, but they don't need any help from the council, and they're fulfilling all their rights as a charitable trust, and they're helping people. They help homeless people, they help people with drug and alcohol problems. They're very easygoing, they have no heavy security, and the people who go there look after the venue generally. Now, this is the opposite of the big society. Now, that may sound very strange. People would be asking, well, wait a minute, if they're a venue that everybody likes and really helps out people and all the different so-called diverse communities, so they have a Afro-Caribbean night, they have an art night, they have Romanian weddings on there, they have everything on there, why wouldn't the local authority like that? Because that's inclusive, isn't it? It's diverse, it's vibrant. Well, I can answer that. Because what they want is community hubs and venues which are police state controlled. They do not want anything that is outside their control. And when I mean their control, I'm talking about the local authority under global governance. And this is what's happening. It's absolutely astonishing that London has changed so much within a couple of years. In fact, it's got to the point where it's unrecognisable, because all of the people that I knew, the sort of people who you'd go meet up with, so I was in entertainment for quite a long time and to an extent still am, but all those people I'd go meet up during the week down in Soho, have a few beers with, I don't know where any of them are. I occasionally meet up with one or two of them, but everything in their lives has changed. The good old days have gone for good, you know. So we're in a very different kind of era now, and it's really escalated in the past 5 to 10 years, but noticeably, horrifically so in the last 2 years, over here anyway.
Well, I got to tell you that, again, in America, we saw some of this too. And anytime you saw entertainers who were on a local level, not the most famous guys you ever saw, but people that had a bit of a, say, local celebrity to them, would band together and create something or buy a piece of property or something like that. There was always interference from the local authorities one way or another, even though they were not required to police it. And it was there for the general good of the community, really, like a safe place for kids to go after school, let's just say, things like that. And then, at night it would become a venue for concerts and things. Sometimes, dance, DJs, it depended, it was all different types of artistic expression that were featured in this place, even poetry readings, painting displays, art displays of all sorts. And, what happens every single time is that the local authorities find a way to shut it down. And if
in
they
this
can't
case,
do it,
though, Chuck, I'm talking about a charitable trust that's been up there over 100 years, and that's the only thing that's keeping these people from it. It's now under attack by property developers, and because it's a trust, it has certain very interesting rights. But I know what you're saying, but this is kind of a different thing. That's the only reason it's there. That's why I'm mentioning it, because all of the sort of venues that you're talking about, these little independent crazy places, have all gone. There aren't any in London. It's finished. It's over. And once you have every area with its Costa Coffee it's gym, it's mini Tesco, and then, of course, the eye scanners are coming in, and all local businesses are suffering to the point that they are being put out of business or working in the new poverty economy. This is what's going on in London.
Well, yeah, and like I said, it's a similar development here. Of course, it's not the same as a charity that's been around for that amount of time, a charitable organization, which does have certain rights and protections supposedly, but I'm willing to bet that they're quite a bit under attack as well. And what would usually happen here in the U.S. to those independent little weird places is that, magically a fire would come through. Magically, something would go wrong with the property, and then the next thing you know is the greater corporate developers would come in and put in one of these, cookie-cutter places, a McDonald's or, like you said, Starbucks is a big thing here. One of these kinds of places, and a whole bunch of those would spring up, and of course your local pharmaceutical distributor, aka a drugstore. These kinds of things come right on in and take over the area that was formerly really under the use of the people locally and for community purposes. Now, when you have a charitable organization like this that is so well established, can you define for me why that is such a huge difference exactly?
Well, because a charitable trust, this is very interesting, and this could be the future, because a trust means it's an asset, and it's an asset that the people who operate the people who operate that asset have no self-interest in it whatsoever. All as they are doing is helping something function which is for the good of somebody else. So in other words, I'd like to do actually one day something about trust law and how important it is, because it is extremely powerful. So if you set up a trust and there's an executor of that trust, the grantor of that trust, which in this case was the people who survived the Second World War, and the trustees are the people who operate that trust, they have an oath, and they have to swear an oath and take it very seriously. There are people on the trust that I'm on at the moment who have not taken it seriously and have breached their oath, and in the past breached it to the extent that they have really committed what could be called criminal offences. Okay? Now, the breach of trust is extremely serious because it's a breach of an oath under God. It's basically like perjuring yourself in court. So, if you are a trustee, you have a responsibility for the transference of the assets and the operation of the trust for the benefit of the community. And the benefactors of that trust are the community. So there is nothing more honourable than a trust. It's not a business, can never be a business, and can only be operated for the good of the beneficiaries.
Which in this case is the community. Now, who enforces this, though? Who is actually sort of the, because generally speaking, I would think there would be some sort of individual that oversees this.
In this country, you've got the Charity Commission, because this is a charitable trust. But trust law is very high in equity law. And basically, in the high courts, trust is the highest form of law. And also, it is the most protected form of law, because I have elements of my property in trusts, and those trusts are private. And if people want to know the details of that trust, they can apply to have that trust opened. So basically, a trust is something that can be and usually is in the private. It is not in the public. But, for instance, I can give you examples of charitable trusts in this country that are meant to work for the benefit of the public, who work against the public interest, and the government are allowing that to happen.
And this is, see, now one would wonder how it is we got from the tower to this, but I think there is a good reason why this will all make sense. Because
okay, I'll give you a good example, Chuck. If that tower had been run by a trust, then the trustees of that building would very likely now be in prison.
For not for not looking out.
And
professional negligence.
And probably manslaughter, because that cladding on that building was known not to be fire retardant. Those people who put that on there knew it was not fire retardant. So that tells you all you need to know. What they've done, they've bodged it up in the short term to basically think, okay, well, it's going to be knocked down in, 4 years. We'll be all right. We'll get away with it. This is my opinion now, but we just need to make it look good for those who are moving in. All these lot are going to go anyway, yeah? All those residents are going. It's going to be knocked down. So let's make it look okay for a bit and save some money. That can go into that. You know, we can give this back to that developer because they're involved with this development, and this will make everyone happy. We'll all have a sweetener out of it. That's what I think's happened.
But meanwhile, there are real human lives that are caught up in this. And it seems to me as though there have been some protests on the street even regarding the handling of this. Now, I don't know how much of that you want to discuss, but look, not everybody's being fooled here. And what is it, corporate manslaughter? Would that be the right term that's being used here?
Well, as the council's a corporation, then that's likely. But the councils have become immune in many respects from any form of liability, and this is very important. So what the councils have done, and not, obviously this is the bigger picture, they have sold out the infrastructure and what's available locally as council housing has been labelled brownfield, which in this country, the term brownfield means that it's like industrial wasteland that could be contaminated. So if you've got a chemical factory and you pull it down, it's labelled brownfield land. It means that land has to be cleansed. It means that whoever buys the land is taking on responsibilities, and they will be liable for any problems on that land. However, the rebranding of all council housing as brownfield land is very important, and that's happened in the last year or so in London. Let me just look at this. It's the Brownfield Summit, 13th, 14th of April 2016, bringing together leading decision makers focused only on brownfield opportunities. Now, wait a minute. There's not many other brownfield sites in London, not really. And if they are, the councils are going to let you build on them. So that's great. That means they don't have to pull the council houses down first. But all council property in London, in Greater London, has been redefined as brownfield, which means it is dirty. It needs to be pulled down. So that's your regeneration plan.
Well, isn't this literally like what they
are from government, boroughs, local boroughs even, the contractors and financiers from the UK, the Middle East and Asia. So London is being sold off as dirty brownfield land because of a summit that happened in Docklands on private land, and no one is allowed to protest, and the people who are being invited in are from other countries and continents.
Well, I'll tell you what, if you have Americans that are coming in to deal with this, which I don't know if you do, but if you do, they're very familiar with the concept because let's just say there's a gas station or something here in this country where the land is very likely tainted by the use of a petrochemical, right? And you tear down that gas station, you now have to go through the process of making it habitable for something else, right? Because the land itself is contaminated, the water table might have been contaminated. So if you were to attempt to draw on the well or whatever else, there might be other sort of hazardous concerns. Of course, there's more extreme examples of this, which do make sense. I mean, obviously, if there's a place that's making, chemical glass or something like that, and it's totally into the ground all around the place, I mean, you would think that before you give it up to, for people to go live or to serve food out of it or something else like that, that one would want it sort of cleansed. But here's the weird rub on this. You're talking about land where people have lived. This is residential housing. How does this become tainted, contaminated, dirty land exactly?
Well, it's called social cleansing, Chuck. Very simple. They want to get rid of all the socially unclean people out of London to bring in the nice new clean ones with lots of money. There you go. That's what it means.
Okay, no, listen, I set it up for you to knock that down. I just wanted to make sure we were clear on this. That really...
Yeah. No, that's actually, this is real. I'm not joking, This conference did take place. Anyone can look it up. The Brownfield Conference, yeah? Brownfield Summit. And basically, it was all part of, a big plan. And Savills, a big estate agent company in Britain, were involved in writing policy called the City Villages document. It was designated in there that they were being labelled as Brownfield Estate. Secretary of State can right. And here is the legislation. The Secretary of State can designate anyone to be planners at designated brownfield sites. In other words, council estates. And councils are required to compile a list of brownfield land, all councils in the country. So this is very, very interesting. And it goes into the Housing and Planning Act 2016, which we can go into a bit later if you like. But basically, it says in the Housing and Planning Act, councils must dispose of surplus land and property. Now, the Secretary of State can arrange and dispose of freehold or leasehold land. So what they've done is they've made this new thing called the London Land Commission, which identifies land and properties in Greater London for selling off. It's like a modern-day doomsday book, but not a property of land, which is going to be the assets of these new developers. So basically, what we're seeing here is your local council, your local authority in this country has just said everything's for sale, it's all up for grabs, we're out of the picture, we've been paid off, get on with it.
And I saw something go by in chat really quickly, which I wonder if there's any aspect to this that lines up with this concept about refugees, because some people think that, what they're going to do is repurpose the land so that they can relocate refugees from other countries into there. I'm not sure about that because I don't know if they're all ready-made, taxable, good, clean people ready to go to be good little slaves. Sorry, I use terminology like that, but I have a problem not seeing it any other way.
No need to be politically correct, Chuck. We're here to fight against all that, aren't we?
Exactly. But look, they're not going to be good little slaves if they're refugees, I think. So I don't think they're looking to move refugees in there. What is the population that they're looking to implant? Exactly.
Okay. I can tell you. They don't want anybody who's self-employed. They want people who work for big corporations. They want people who have money behind them. They want people who are going to be highly taxed and extremely compliant. Let's give you an example of what happened in my local borough, Waltham Forest. I lived there for 24 years. A new initiative came out of Agenda 21 called City Villages. One of the first villages was in Walthamstow Village, which is not really a village. It was a little area of the borough, which was originally on the edge of Epping Forest. So we're talking about 150 years ago. This place was just a little village. In the early 1900s, it grew and grew and grew into a sprawling suburb of 250 to 300,000 people. Now, in 2013, they started talking about Walthamstow Village, that it was going to be a new idea called Mini Holland. That sounds good, doesn't it? Mini Holland. Everyone on bikes, everyone sat out at cafes, everyone bohemian, everything easygoing, you know. But no, it's not about that really, but that was the tag. And what they do, and this is answering your question in a very broad way, so they brought people into the area. So what happened was you had population within that area. When I moved in, a lot of West Indians, they seemed to move out. The Asians stayed. There's quite a lot of Asians there in Walthamstow. Then they started to move in the East Europeans, Lithuanians, etc., Estonians even. There's lots of people there, East Europeans. The East Europeans kind of just all came in very, very quickly. So the whole demography changed. And then they announced this Mini Holland. And very shortly after that, all these hipsters, these young people started moving in. And their parents were clearly buying them property, and the housing market was grossly inflated. I mean, we're talking 4 to 5 times the actual worth of the property. When I moved in there in the early 90s, you could easily buy yourself a little flat there. It was just after the property boom, and you could buy something really quite nice for about I bartered a bit. And I never even paid my mortgage off. I got one for less than 40 grand, about 37 grand I think I paid for a little flat with a garden. Okay. And it was walkable to a tube station. And that was in a converted late Victorian house. When I left that borough, those houses, 2 up, 2 downs with a little garden, very cramped, were going for 780,000. Now, that's nearly $1 million, right? So those people who are moving into that area, and there were people moving in who were buying this property, and they were young, upwardly mobile professionals, the yuppies, they were all moving in. So where are they getting that money from? Well, it's very easy when you look at it. Their parents want them to have somewhere to live, because they live in London, and they don't want them renting. So what their parents have done, and I've seen several examples of this because the parents were round at some of their houses sometimes, and I'd talk to them, and they'd say, yeah, well, we've remortgaged our house and we had a bit of property and we've given them we're basically paying for them to live here, right? Right. Let's go back to the 50s and 60s when their parents bought their houses. We're in the 70s, okay? Okay. They bought houses which were 3 to 4 bedrooms, they had a drive, they were these 1950s type houses, with quite a bit of room around them. Okay, so a lot of people in this country, I'm not talking about just middle class people, a lot of people had that sort of property. It's not expensive or wasn't expensive. So what the parents have done is downsize, put themselves into a little granny flat somewhere, sold the main property, given all the proceeds of that property to their children, who have now bought a 1-bedroom or 2-bedroom flat, or at most a 2 up, 2 down, which is tiny, that they can't really even rent a room out in. So what they've done is they have basically put themselves into the poverty economy. And they've given away all of their property to something which is not going to be worth anything in the future and can be compulsory purchased and knocked down. And that's the idea of what's going on. This is the destruction of property rights. It's the destruction of all rights under global governance. And people are beginning to see it now, because all of this is going to collapse. And then the property developers are going to come in, buy it all up at nothing prices and rebuild in high density housing. So all of London will be these tiny little flats, or flats that are owned by people who have huge amounts of money and just use them as safety deposit boxes for money laundering.
You know what's hysterical here, Mark? We're almost out of time during this hour. And why do I say hysterical? Because I do mean it does evoke laughter. We have seen exactly this trend with slightly different terminology here in the U.S. And this is why I love drawing these comparisons, because it is exactly the same thing. It is not a matter of national origin. It's not a matter of the alleged land on which you stand. It is a matter of a global agenda, because here they utilized condominiums in the very same way. You bought what we would call an apartment, what you would call a flat, okay? They bought that in these buildings and in these little engineered communities, which wound up not having any value. And then when the housing crash happened, all of these people that had millions of dollars worth of property before had sold it off for virtually nothing in exchange. And then they wonder how it is they grow broke. Anyway, Mark Windows is with me, and we are discussing Agenda 21, the connection to the Tower fire in London, and a whole lot more as we get into the corruption of gentrification and how it is populations are being maneuvered away from their property, their rights, and, hey, anything resembling a community. Stay tuned to the Ochelli Effect. We'll be right back after this. I think I'm a bit more of a man of science fiction than science, because I do enjoy the genre. This is indeed the Ochelli Effect, and it is a Wednesday. Yes, I do stick my tongue inside of my cheek on occasion and make jokes, but what we're talking about tonight with Mark Windows for the full 2 hours, by the way, is certainly not a joke. It is the displacement of populations. It is the use of Agenda 21 and the greater sort of agenda, which is beyond 21 at this point, but hey, let's stick with the terms we know. The Agenda 21, implementation that is occurring, the fact that they create these trendy zones and then turn around and flip over the property rights of the individuals who were there, who are lifelong residents, and displace them because they're just simply not good enough wage slaves to occupy said areas, which, can be changed status-wise over and over again. And meanwhile, everybody gets a whole lot less for their money. They get a whole lot more compacted like sardines into cans, and those cans happen to be the buildings in the alleged cities that are there, to provide you with greater metropolitan opportunities and all of that good stuff. Not really. It's really there to be the systematic thievery that is the stealing of one's own ability to even have the possibility to own property, to be a part of a community, and all of it under the guise of community development, of moving things further into the future, of, modernizing, right? We see these communities here in America often, which are created to be more trendy, more accessible, more, I'll use that word, metropolitan in one way or another, right? You have the better cafes, and you have the slightly more upscale this and that and the third thing, maybe a wine bar instead of your local, sawdust joint where there was a lot of beer served. Generally, you see things go up like that, and all of a sudden people are being priced out of their neighborhoods and moved out. That is what we call gentrification here. We watched it with the condominiums. We watched it with the sale of apartments. We watched it with the developers who develop all kinds of things that are never occupied, and in some cases not even completed, just so that the land is under development, and therefore they're being paid. And who is actually being paid to make sure that you personally are being displaced from your communities? Well, it is the alleged representatives right there. They call them the councils. In England, we call them town councils, we call them municipalities, various other things, but what they are is the corporate arms of the greater global corporation. And again, Mark Windows is with me from windowsontheworld.net. I do advise you to go over there and check him out. Maybe not right this second. Finish listening to this show, but do go over there afterwards. Check out the articles which Mark has referenced. Check out his videos. And of course, do listen to the other radio shows and things that he does. He is extremely informative, and I'm quite happy to have him with me to walk me through the English version of what I do know so well in America. So here we go. Agenda 21, onward and upward, Mark.
Yeah, it's very interesting because we talked about that idea of brownfield, which is, you wouldn't have believed this could have happened a few years ago, that council estates would be labelled as brownfield, which is basically industrial, dirty wasteland. And councils are now required to compile a list of their brownfield land. Oops! What do you mean by brownfield land? Well, really, the council estates, those people who are inhabiting spaces which could be used to bring in people who are on higher incomes, who can afford higher price of property. So this is what's happening. This is what the regeneration of London is all about. The re-engineering is actually all about social cleansing, but on a scale that is absolutely massive. And the social cleansing now actually affects and targets what they used to call the middle classes.
Mark, the reason why I draw these parallels, I want to give you one more before you move on, because I know you've got to load more information, but I lived in New York City for a while, and there is this area that they call the Lower East Side. Okay.
Yes.
There's an area there which used to be quite a bit of a drug den, if you will, that they called Alphabet City. This is all surrounding an area of parkland that they call Tompkins Square Park. And yes, indeed, during a time when they had riots in Tompkins Square, during a time when there was civil unrest, during a time when there was an outcry, in fact, for greater policing in various parts of New York City at the very same time, they cleaned up, world famous Times Square, got rid of all the hookers and the strip joints and things like that, allegedly to clean it up just to make it a cleaner city. They turned around and gentrified that area as well. Now, people there were on what they called rent control. So there was a lifetime agreement that they could only have incremental raises in their rent according to this very small amount. And literally, you lived there very, very cheaply. Most people were lifetime residents of an area, stuff like that. But incrementally, they removed them under the auspices of cleaning it up for New York University. Okay, and creating, universities. This is a positive use of a rundown area and things like that. But residents,
everything negative is done with a positive cover, isn't it, Chuck?
That's the thing. You see, and that's what I was getting to, is that this is New York City, and I'm talking about something that I started to watch unfold in the 1990s with my own eyes, Mark. This is not, this is not like I read about it. This isn't I saw it on TV. This is I saw this happen. And I think that the story is no different in this part of London we're talking about than what it was in New York City then, what it is in many cities now, where you see these specialized boutique sort of areas spring up, which are meant to attract the upper echelon of those who are good wage slaves of some sort or another, who have some sort of wealth that can be siphoned off. Either it's their parents' wealth, as you described, or it's their personal wealth that they've gained recently one way or another. They're sold a bill of goods. They're sold a small box in the nice, clean, new part of the city and all of that. And meanwhile, nobody ends up retaining any value of any sort. And in fact, this is only one stage in what's really yet to come, isn't it?
Yes, what I would say, though, Chuck, is that this has happened for a long time, but the escalation of this is now off the charts. And that's what this tower fire has really brought into the public domain. And in a way, this could actually be the catalyst to opening up a lot of people to what's going on. But when I lived in that area of London, which I described in northeast London,
right,
in the 90s, there was no sign of any of this. No sign at all. The place didn't really change until about 2 or 3 years ago. And when it changed radically and dramatically and with no input from the locals at all. In other words, when they said we're having a consultation, it was completely fake. Now, I don't think they were doing that years ago to that extent. What they've done is they've
let me ask you a question. Let me ask you a question because something just occurred to me as you were speaking. Did they turn around and present it to the public maybe in the beginning as, you know what we're going to do? We're going to take care of the homeless problem in this particular area. We're going to clean it up because it's become a bit run down. So what we're going to do is take care of the homeless problem under the guises of actually helping people out. We're going to get them off the streets so that your neighborhoods are a little easier to navigate, so you're not dealing with these people, this kind of thing. Did they do something like that?
Oh, no, they did something much more cynical than that.
Oh, okay.
They appealed to the petty greed of the people who were moving in. And they started putting out a little local paper. And this is a very important thing as well. They put out something called, the Waltham Forest Echo, which was a change agent newspaper run out of a community hub. And they told people what they were going to get. They said, Mini Holland is coming. And this is what they do in Tottenham, for instance, which actually you could say is in need of regeneration, because it's really, it's quite a depressing place. If anywhere needed a bit of regeneration, it would be there. But what they're going to get is not the sort of regeneration that they're being told. What's going to actually happen is that the indigenous population will be kicked out. Now, the problem they've got this is an interesting one, actually, Chuck, because it's not quite like Waltham Forest, where they had a kind of, they had some East Londoners there, they had West Indians and a lot of Asians. Now, what happened was the people who'd lived there all their lives, the old East Londoners, all seemed to disappear. They disappeared over the last 5 to 10 years. The West Indians, a lot of them seemed to disappear. And you had then, of course, the East Europeans coming in, lots of East Europeans, but it's still quite an Asian borough. There was always a lot of Asians there. But the thing is that what they're doing now is draconian. It's totally different. It's not like, it's a corporate thing. This is a global thing. And when it gets to places like Tottenham, they're frightened because they know that they could have riots on their hands. So they're handling it slightly with kid gloves. But in these other boroughs, they're not doing that. But Tottenham is the next place to be regenerated. Of course, that was the scene of the riots in 2011. And, of course, the Broadwater Farm Estate riots in, I think, the 80s. That was very serious. So you've got a powder keg that can go off at any time. And there's people behind that powder keg. The people who are actually involved in it are actually not the ones controlling the narrative. And that came out in the riots because there was agitation groups put in there when it kicked off. So
well, and then along with that, I guarantee that there's local gangsters of sorts who are participating in trying to, get some sort of payoff out of controlling that situation too.
Oh, very much so. Mm-hmm. We're talking about big financial interests, and I know this because the area where the venue is that I'm quite involved with has its own car park. It has a very large capacity for that area, and it's the only independent venue in that area. And it is being incredibly targeted, as we stated before. But it's going to be interesting how this regeneration happens there, because they're going to have to factor in outside forces, because that place will actually revolt. And there are areas in London that will. And this is what they are very, very afraid of. So getting back to this tower, this fire, right. This tower could literally ignite a lot of this stuff. So the fact that hundreds of people, we don't know quite how many have died in there, because there's been pretty much a media blackout, and everybody's getting all their information from the alternative media or YouTube, and there are some very good videos on YouTube of people confronting the mainstream media there, and they're very angry. There was also a big revolt at the town hall, and the police were struggling to cope. Now, this is what we were talking about in hour one of the show, that there is a great possibility of mass civil disobedience. However, in my opinion, this is not the way to go. There are people going to want to do it, and they're going to rob televisions out of shops and all the other stupid nonsense things that happen. But riots never accomplish anything. All they do is give in to the other side, ultimately. But there are going to be problems. I think a lot of this is starting to come undone, and that's what I'm starting to find quite interesting about it.
Well, see, that's why I pointed out that I think not the entire population is fooled here, that this is just a matter of happenstance. That, look, things happen in rundown tenements, and, maybe it was even the fault of those who lived there, or, things like that are usually brought up.
Just to correct you there, we don't have rundown tenements these days. The councils have a lot of money from central government for refurbishment of these buildings. They prefer not to do it. They put them into managed decline. They covered this building in stuff that was not fit for purpose, which has caused a massive fire, killed lots of people, and has been a huge embarrassment to them. So I think we're a bit beyond that now.
Oh, I know. That's why I threw it at you.
Yeah.
Because, again, I don't want anybody to be fooled by the idea that, sometimes this does happen, and there is such a thing as urban blight when it occurs, in a city that is on the decline because they're losing their businesses. Nobody has any jobs. There is no money to repair things. This does happen in municipalities, but here's the problem. It's almost always done by design. Mark, I don't care what anybody tells me. There is no way that some of this stuff fails. Continuously escalating taxation, and yet there's no money. Continuously escalating development deals that go to these grand corporations to bring in some of these entities that are from the cookie cutter, retail reality, all come into play, and yet there's no money for anything. It's interesting to me because where the money has actually gone is, not to the community, and where the assets to develop it, take care of it, maintain it, also don't go to the community. So I guarantee you there's a lot of places out there that have probably been clad, in one way or another, in something to cover up the reality of the decay because, after all, this is being done by design. Or do you think I'm out of line?
No, that's what we were talking about in the first hour, really. I mean, what this points to is, I've never really watched the Hunger Games. I've seen clips from it. I don't know what it's about, but the Hunger Games is basically a documentary of what's going on. This is what they're creating. What's very disturbing about all this is that they seem to really have factored in a lot of what they are now doing to control the narrative. In other words, they're expecting people to revolt in a certain way. So I would suggest that people don't do that. They become entirely unpredictable and form small groups, which is what they're terrified of. And this is going to be the antidote to what's going on. And a very interesting side issue, Chuck, with the Queen's speech. I was just reading that Prince Harry has said that none of those so-called royal kids want to be on the throne, which is very interesting. And the Queen, this is an interesting one, actually, because a lot of this stuff that she's been saying, it ties into what's going on here.
Well, but, before you quote that, I want to say something here because I found it interesting, and I am not what they would call an Anglophile over here. I'm not somebody who follows royalty and thinks that they're to be deified. There are Americans who absolutely live and die by the news from the throne. I want to tell you that. Really, I'm serious. And the thing is, I looked at that and I said to myself, they have sent her out in front to give an appeal to authority among the masses, to get them to say, you know what, the crown has acknowledged this, and therefore nothing to see here. This is just move on, move forward. But then it seemed to me like somebody got the script mixed up here, because something went wrong with this presentation where she was supposed to go out there and I think calm the people that were getting ready to react in a way they didn't want. Now, like you said, the uncontrolled rioting situation is now something that they're prepared for. They actually planned for it. It's not going to accomplish what it may have accomplished at one other time. But other forms of civil disobedience in an organized fashion that are not in a unified group which can be taken down in one fell swoop might actually be the thing that they're most worried about. But I think those that adhere to the idea that the crown is still the great authority, probably got, pacified a bit by her appearance.
Well, maybe they've got the wrong crown. Maybe they've got the wrong crown because the Crown Corporation is much more powerful than the one that she wears on her head, and she's not part of that corporation. And what was interesting, Chuck, I just wanted to bring this up because I don't think we mentioned it, was that the crown travelled in a separate vehicle to the Queen. And guess what? The Queen didn't even wear it. So that's interesting, isn't it? So the crown had its own vehicle, right? And the Queen wasn't wearing one, and the two never actually met.
which sounds like I'm sorry, I'm laughing, but it sounds like a very...
No, you should be. It's hilarious.
To me, that is funny. What is the Queen without a crown, right? Well, let's write a poem, Mark. No, but the thing
it's a woman
is,
wearing purple in a very bad hat.
That's true. That was the visual, but again, it's so strange because the office that is the crown is not the Queen. That's another weird thing that goes on. But she's still the figurehead that's presented to the public. I scarcely understand why.
Well, it's interesting that Prince Harry, and they always use Prince Harry because I think there is a good chance that he's James Hewitt's son and not Prince Charles. That's an opinion. You have no conclusive proof of that, but he looks totally different from the others.
Be careful, Mark. I think. Wait a second. Be careful, Mark. I think those laws are still in place in the UK that I don't want to see you gone because.
Well, no, I don't think that's done for a reason. The thing is, Chuck, that years ago I sent an affidavit to the Queen to say I was no longer a member of the British Empire and I had no allegiance to the Crown whatsoever, and that should all go off and basically do themselves. I was no part of this anymore. I'm paraphrasing, obviously, and I put it more succinctly than that, but that was registered at Buckingham Palace, so they're quite aware of my views on this anyway.
Okay, no, hey, look, as long as I just don't want you to somehow get, I would not want this appearance on this show to be the reason why, you're held somewhere, because...
No, I don't think they hold me somewhere, Chuck. I think a car crash is usually, or was in the last instance, the most popular and probably the most likely prospect for the last person who they really didn't like.
Okay, no, that's fine. That's fine.
I shoot my brakes quite often, but you never can be too careful, I suppose.
But back to it. I mean, let's help the American listener understand why there is such an interesting point to be made here that the Crown travels in a different vehicle than the Queen.
Yeah. Who's meant to be wearing the bloody thing, yeah.
Right. Oh, this does crack me up. But
it's funny, isn't it?
It is hysterical. But why did that happen? I mean, please explain, Mark.
Well, what I think is happening is maybe an admission. This is my opinion. I've no proof of this. But looking at things in a bigger perspective, I think it's their way of saying that they all want out of it now. We have an illegitimate queen who's never dissolved Parliament, who's never actually said anything against the treason of the European Union. She never has a voice. Whatever assumptions they have made about their own participation in their version, their assumption of what goes on in the country, she can't really claim authorship for anything.
But yet Minister May had to go to her for approval to form the government. I could have swore I read not very long ago.
Oh, yes. These are all protocols. But let's look at what the Queen really is.
Okay.
She's meant to be the figurehead of the state. She's meant to be the monarch. She is the person who can dissolve Parliament. Now, we have a corporate structure that's been put in place which bypasses her. And indeed, the City of London bypasses her authority every day of the week because they create massive financial fraud. And if she was a proper monarch, she would have to intervene in that. Whereas several years ago, she was filmed inside an investment bank, I think, someplace in the city, asking them how it worked. Well, let's go back not even 500 years. No monarch would ever ask a financial institution how it worked. The financial institution would tell the monarch how it worked.
No, right. The monarch would explain to the financial institution how it works. I got you. You might have broken up on the Skype there, but that's the way things would go, you would think. But it's not very Roman anymore, it appears to me, because, Caesar could dismiss.
Well, Roman. They represent the Holy Roman Empire, but they're not Roman. Yeah.
Well, I understand. That's why I was making that reference. But the thing is, as I remember, Caesar, turned around and got rid of the Senate because he could.
Yeah.
So this is not very Roman in its structure. It appears as though there is someone else in charge. And, as you were saying, this is why it is worthy to mention the City of London versus London. And it's a rather curious thing. I'm sorry I digressed into this, but rather worth mentioning when we're going to talk about the presentation to the public from the alleged monarch. Okay, because you would think this is the figurehead coming out to calm the masses, to let them know that everything's going to be okay, because really that's what a leader would do. Right? If someone is the head of a government, if someone is the head of an empire, if someone is, am I making sense here or am I not?
Oh, yes. Absolutely. The thing is, though, that I think this is quite a symbolic gesture by them. So the crown travels in a different car and she doesn't wear it. So she's on a throne giving a speech without a crown. So she can't be the queen. Or she has a problem with the crown. And Prince Harry, it was in the Daily Mail today, Prince Harry's astonishing claim about the future of the monarchy is revealed in an extraordinary interview. Well, it's not really. It's just a few things he said off the cuff. It's not even an extraordinary. This is the way they do it, you see. They want to be, it's a revelation. Not really. He said, Prince Harry, 32, claimed that nobody in his family wants to be king or queen. Well, they wouldn't. He's not part of the royal family if you look at it. His mother had an illicit relationship outside royalty. He's probably the result because He's got ginger hair, and he's the only one who's kept his hair so far. But he says he also seemed to criticise the decision to make him walk behind his mother's coffin. Now, what he actually said was that's really traumatic for a 12-year-old, which is fair enough. The fifth in line to the throne insisted the UK needs the magic of the monarchy. So that's an interesting one, because the whole idea of a monarchy is it's a bloodline that has magic and supernatural. And they have neither a bloodline nor magic nor the supernatural, which is very interesting. That's my view of it, because if they had magic or the supernatural, they would be revered. They would be revered by people because people may be able to see it in them, or a certain part of the population would. But nobody does because they haven't got it. And I think that's a major part of what's gone wrong. When we talked about that tower fire at the beginning of the show, the reason all this is happening under global governance is because we do not have a monarchy. The monarchy has acquiesced to corporate interests. It acquiesced initially to the Rothschilds and the bankers, then it acquiesced to the City of London, and now it's acquiesced to global governance. So that's why the Crown travelled in its own vehicle, because it's so bloody pissed off with her, it doesn't want to be seen with her.
And that is kind of a magical statement in and of itself, but it doesn't mean that she possesses it. And
yeah.
You know, and again, if you were such a magical and supernatural being, I guess you could tell a financial institution how it's supposed to react on the land over which you are the monarch. So, it all makes sense now, and I appreciate that, Mark. Thank you.
I don't know whether it makes sense, Chuck. I've just thrown those things in because I thought it was quite interesting that it coincided with all this. Because it's the first time since 1974 that she's not worn a crown in her address to the state. So, is it symbolic? I don't know. I don't know whether any of this stuff is symbolic anymore because we're under corporate governance.
Well, and isn't that really the important thing here, which leads us all to why it is that many people, and it doesn't even matter how many at this point, because nobody's giving accurate accounts, it seems, as to who it is that died in this fire, what exactly the damage done really amounts to, because after all, it's just something that's going to be knocked down, and it's part of the dirty land and made dirty by the fact that there were not good enough wage slaves to render it clean. So, you know, here we go. Sounds all very ritualistic, Mark. I don't know. Maybe that's just my given.
Well, there is a certain element of truth in what you're saying. It's just that we have to stick to facts, really, if we're going to be journalistic. But my belief is that it doesn't matter to these people if they sacrifice a few hundred. It's not important to them. They're not thinking of it in that way. Whether there's a conspiracy to murder is a completely different thing, which we can't get into because we don't know. Right. My gut feeling is that there could be something behind it. But sticking with the facts, it's bad enough because what it's done inadvertently is exposed the agenda that we've been talking about for the past hour and a half.
Right. And quite honestly, it's not unfair to describe a group of individuals deciding collectively to be neglectful as a conspiracy either. So I think that the word conspiracy is not meeting the word theory here. I think it's evident that it took more than one individual to allow this disrepair to occur with this cladding, with the fact that things became just sort of superficially fixed up a bit and things like that. One would say that it would require a group of individuals deciding to act together. So I think that the word conspiracy is not unfair. However, murder versus, well, that term that people keep using, manslaughter, are two entirely different cases. It may not have been the intention directly to have this many bodies piled there, but also there was no care taken to avoid it. And again, this is not one individual who did this, Mark. So again, I think the word conspiracy is not unfair. What do you think?
No, I agree. I mean, obviously, it's a conspiracy at some level, and the conspiracy at the level we've talked about obviously exists because the cladding on that building was not fit for purpose. It was not fire retardant. So, something has been done there which has subverted something within law, I would think. Now, we have talked about most of the aspects of it already, but when you look at the bigger picture of this, when it comes to things like corporate greed, you can say, okay, did they let it happen by accident or did they let it happen by design?
Right.
And those are two slightly different things, but it's very difficult because I think that within all this, what it seems to me is that you have this element of greed which has been co-opted in because they are the chosen advocates. So, in other words, you've got these local councils who are now unaccountable, who are operated entirely under a corporate structure for financial gain. And they are being mentored into a program which they don't really understand. So where does any of this become criminal? That's the interesting thing, because...
Well, you know, that's another aspect here, too, real quickly, because on the news flashes, again, sent to the U.S., we heard words like inquiry and inquests and things like this. That's what it sounded like to me anyway, and it just flew by real fast. But there were these possibilities that there might be something that sounded like investigations into exactly how this went wrong. But what will that actually yield? Will anyone be held accountable is the greater question here, because I've seen the inquest process and it doesn't necessarily guarantee, accountability. And I've seen these inquiries that are held in other places seemingly under the same types of rule of law that exist in the courts over there. Maybe I misunderstand them. But at the end of them, quite often, there is no accountability anyway. There's just a discovery of some facts, and maybe not even a complete discovery of those facts. I mean, am I misunderstanding something here?
No, that's very good analysis. But what came out of the Queen's speech, or after the Queen's speech, was a new independent public advocate will be created to represent bereaved families. So this again is stating that no, you're not going to get a proper inquiry. We're going to control the narrative, and there's nothing going to come out of this that's going to incriminate anybody. That's what it seems to be saying at this stage. Also, there's going to be a civil disaster reaction task force. Now, all this is starting to sound again very military and very corporate. It's corporate militarization, a civil disaster reaction task force. Now, what could that possibly mean? Is that a load of goons who are dressed up in uniforms who look like the army or the police, or is it something else? Basically, it's very, very interesting. So they're going to get another level like the territorial support group, like the new, what I term them martial law terror clowns. Then you've got the army on the street. Then you've got private army on the street. Then you've got private corporations who look like the army on the street. This is all really behind what they're saying. But when they're saying a new independent public advocate will be created to represent the bereaved families, you know that there is not going to be any kind of satisfactory public inquiry into this.
Yeah, that's the notion that I take away. I do say that, it seems like maybe there will be the need to pay off a few people to get the bereaved families to quiet down. And this is something that happens during these sorts of cases as well. Do you think that that's even going to be part of the equation, or are they just going to sort of sweep them aside? I mean, what does it look like?
I've no idea, but nothing is off the charts, and we've got to remember that this is not about money. So everybody can be bought off. This has happened in all local authorities. The people who you think represent you do not represent you. They are not fit for office. They are not under oath. They are under corporate governance. So when people ask for accountability, who are they asking accountability from? Because your local council or the people who you assume to be responsible for this are not accountable. They cannot be accountable because they are held to ransom or have sold out and been bought out by these big corporations. So who is able to be prosecuted in a corporation? You'd have to take the CEO over to court. Now, most of the people who are trying to get to terms with this wouldn't know any of that. They can try and find out, but it's always going to be blocked.
Well, let me be cynical. Let me be cynical for a second too, because quite honestly, not only is if you take a corporation and you try and hold them accountable for something like this, the reality is that a fine usually gets paid, which was already factored into the cost-benefit analysis. So here's the thing: even if you see millions of pounds or dollars or whatever it is in a fine, it was already factored in as part of the cost of doing business anyhow. So it's really a pointless gesture that they hope they might not have to pay as a corporate entity. That's usually the game plan. And unfortunately, see, here I am being cynical and really wanting to throw up at this point, Mark, honestly, not because of you, but because of the fact that it doesn't matter that human beings were burnt to death. Okay. It doesn't matter that, effectively a burnt offering was had here under the guise of corporate greed and global governance. Bottom line. And
right.
This is a wretched, horrendous thing that is seemingly unstoppable and ubiquitous. It is literally everywhere. And, I'm astounded that there isn't some remedy here. I mean, what would be the remedy to this in your estimation? I know I'm putting a lot on you now, but I mean, there's got to be a way to do battle with this, because this to me is literally the root of an evil way.
What I'm trying to do is objectify what's happened, put it objectively. We have to be objective about these things because we are being thrust into a climate of fear, and the idea that we have no control all the time. What I would suggest to people is that they form small groups. They do not get involved at all with local councils. They keep them completely at arm's length, because my interactions with all this stuff in the recent past, has been that the council take over, they create an artificial group, which is a protest group, which is completely co-opted to shut the thing down. So form your own group, have nothing to do with the council, look at the law, and try and hold these people in office to account. Go to the Royal Courts of Justice, go and consult with masters, learn to be competent, because this is the only way you're going to do it. Sorry to sound boring, but protesting at town halls and kicking off with the police achieves nothing. They've already factored that in. They're not interested in that. What they're scared of is people of competence. And all of this goes back to the oath of office. These people have an oath in their office. Let's go back to the Bible, Hebrews 6:16. People swear by something greater than themselves. And the oath confirms what is said and puts an end to argument. So that's the legal remedy. These people have sworn an oath. They have breached their oath of office. They do not represent you. They are not worthy of their office because they've breached their covenant with God. So do something about it. Don't go setting fire to things and attacking the police, because that's not going to do anything. All that's going to do is put you in prison, get you fined, and get even more property and rights taken off you. And property and rights is what they're going after.
And honestly, provide an excuse to clamp down even further on any sort of future dissent.
Exactly.
So that's, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's really shocking. I mean, I've seen so much of this, and I've seen the suffering that people are under. And don't think for 1 minute, Chuck, that I'm not sort of empathic or have empathy to it, because I do. But I know what we've got to do. This is an absolute war against humanity. It's a war against people.
Right.
And the people who are at war against you are just corporate slaves. They have no idea what they're doing. You cannot hold them accountable. They will not be held accountable. So what you have to do at some point is get back to some recourse through law, because it doesn't matter what level this is on, whether it's on the level of, well, I don't owe £500 council tax and they're trying to take my house. It doesn't matter whether it's that or burning you to death. In the end, you're just talking about dishonesty and perversion of natural law. And these people wouldn't know natural law if it hit them in the face. And natural law is inherent in nature and inherent in everybody. So we have to ask ourselves, why are we actually putting up with this? We're consenting to it. We're letting them do it. That's the thing. So the only way around it is to know who you are and be competent. And if you don't know who you are and you're not competent, then this is going to happen over and over again. It's happened for thousands of years. It's not going to stop now, and especially now, because this agenda is ramping up so quickly. I mean, we are in an absolute poverty economy. People are hanging on. They have been for years. And what's happening is that corporates are getting more and more power. So at what point do people say, I have rights? At what point do they do that? Rather than bleating about the injustice of it all, why don't they just say, I have rights? And I'm going to enforce those rights, and you will have to come up with a very good counter argument legally. And that's how people took over the squats in the 70s and got rehoused, including the present Labour leader's brother, Piers. We went and filmed all the old places where these people were rehoused, and Piers has been in his flat for many, many years on the now threatened Aylesbury estate, and he's now a housing activist and always has been. So it really is up to the public. They can sit and watch television, they can get fat drinking beer and being entertained, or they can do something about it. And it's that simple, in my opinion, because of what I've seen is that the solutions are there.
Well, yeah, the solutions are there, Mark. And just a second, because your Skype is breaking up a little bit. The solutions are there, but the reality
lazy and too well fed and too ignorant about it.
Well, right, but the reality is this: they're the only person, because a lot of people turn around and say, well, I put my faith in this leader, this party, this organization, so on and so forth. They're going to protect me. They're going to look out for me.
Why would you give your power to another person or organization? The power resides within yourself.
That's what I was getting to.
Exactly.
we're having a little breakup here between us, but
I missed a bit of that, Chuck, but I got the general gist. Yeah.
The idea here, though, is that the only person who is going to protect your right to even live is you. The only person that's going to solve this is you. Now, it may be through the instrument of utilizing your competence in a court of law. It may be through simply declarations, which are necessary, through maneuverings, around or through certain systems. But the thing is, you have the right to control your own destiny, one way or another. If you acquiesce it over to these other people, well, they can turn around and sell it off to the highest bidder and treat you as the commodity that they do. And that's what it comes down to.
Chuck. Goes back to what we were talking about weeks ago, about you being assumed property. So if you do not actually state your rights and act competently, then you're just property. And property can be destroyed. Let's look at it objectively here and stop getting drawn into emotional arguments, because emotional arguments go nowhere. People are on the television going, how could this happen? And people died. Yes, they have died. And it will happen again and again and again until people are able to wake up and be competent and realize that they are able to actually have competence and influence over what's going on. And you don't do that through civil disobedience. You do it by forming small groups and attacking the enemy. Think about what the enemy are doing and then apply it back against them. And that's the most dangerous thing that anybody can actually say, because that's what they're actually really scared of.
Well, yeah. Now look, civil disobedience is an odd term too, and we've only got about 10 minutes left.
Absolutely, yeah.
But civil disobedience is an odd term because on some levels there is a useful means by which civil disobedience can be utilized. I don't mean rioting. I don't mean violence. I do mean literally being disobedient. Okay,
exactly.
Is useful. Okay, but to turn around and destroy property or to injure others, this kind of thing is extremely counterproductive. It may be the last, vestige of a way to communicate for an oppressed population on occasion. Sometimes it is really the only way that oppressed people will articulate themselves because they have been for so long without a voice. That does happen. And it's not something that anybody should be looking forward to. But not being obedient to the system, I'm sorry, I agree with a bit of civil disobedience.
Yes, well, that's not quite what I meant. I mean,
I know, but I'm taking the term. I'm taking the term and reapplying it because you know what? I'm going to utilize this language the way that I see fit. Okay. And I'm not going to be told how it runs. You know what I mean? I know what you meant, Mark. I'm saying to people that the idea of being civil and disobedient at the same time is not, just, reserved for those who wish to riot and loot and do destructive things. There is a way of being disobedient.
A perfect analysis of that statement. Be civil and be disobedient. Be disobedient civilly, but better still, use what you have got and do not tell the opposition what you are doing, because the whole reason why none of this will ever go anywhere and people will not have a proper public inquiry into this is because they tell everybody what they're doing. They're going on saying, we want this, we want that. No, get into a small group, organise yourselves and get some proper backing. Get some pro bono lawyers, start fighting it, and don't tell anybody. Because this is what the opposition do. They're not going to tell you what they're doing. I mean, this is the whole point of Agenda 21. It's there if you want to read it, but they're not going to tell you about it. They're not going to tell you that it's about mass depopulation and loss of all your property rights. They're not going to tell you that because you don't need to hear it, and it's not good for you to hear it, and you might get angry if you do.
And which is exactly why they bury it in friendly-sounding terminology and ideals that are being pushed by these social engineers. This is exactly how it works. So there you go. And Mark, I really appreciate the fact that you stuck out a full 2 hours with me. And and went all the way through this because this is an extremely important issue, not simply because of the current events, not simply because the population there in London is pressurized at this point, not only because of the recent alleged terror and terrorist attacks. Again, see yesterday's show if you want to hear the difference between terror and terrorism. But anyway, the thing is that because there is a pressurized atmosphere among the population, they are much more susceptible to being manipulated. And I think that's why the timing of this, again, me and my suspicious mind, is fully suspect. And the agenda is exactly as you laid it out, Mark, and I really appreciate this. And of course, unfortunately, you and I are going to have to continue this conversation because the agenda is not quite stopping for us yet, is it?
Oh, it won't do that, but we can interrupt it and we can subvert it and we can take back control. But it's really about people being responsible. And the thing that's happened is a terrible tragedy, but it's exposed the machinations of the agenda, in my opinion.
And in some ways, a disaster can become a blessing, and unfortunately, it is often individuals that will wind up dying in order to teach the lessons to those that survive. So this is precisely what we're seeing here. And again, this is not something limited to London. This is not something limited to the UK. This is a worldwide phenomena, and no matter where you're sitting, I guarantee you can witness some aspect of this unfolding right before your very eyes, because as Mark so adequately and so eloquently explained to you many times already during this show, this is a global agenda, and it is accelerating. So, we keep that in mind. I don't believe in doom and gloom, Mark. I do say that there is an answer, and at the end of the day, anyone who is disturbed by what we've discussed tonight needs to understand that they themselves actually hold the keys to all of the answers regarding this. As you said, there is the idea of being competent, understanding, and embracing your natural rights, which were endowed upon you by your creation. Regardless of creator, regardless of concept, regardless of God you pray to, bottom line is, simply because you are a creation, you were endowed with said rights, which I could have swore were sort of unalienable, but then again, it could be that American psychosis kicking in again. That idea that these were things that were actually not granted by papers, by men, or by individuals who are supposed to be monarchs, but actually something that was granted to me by the source, which I do identify as God, but you don't have to, Mark. You can identify it as simply your creation, and therefore you are endowed with exactly the same rights and privileges, unless, again, maybe I'm just experiencing that American psychosis.
Not at all. This is the key to it all. It means we have inalienable rights, and those who have sworn an oath of office, which these people who are responsible for this tragedy have a lot to answer for, because the oath is to a higher power, and the oath puts an end to argument. So, we now have to find out who's responsible. Go after those who are responsible.
And I do say, once again, the wisdom in what you were talking about, the very short quote that I'm going to carry with me now for a while, is that anybody who is somehow possessed with the idea that the paradigm which has been prescribed for you by, media talking heads, political figureheads, whatever they may be, whether they consider themselves royalty or alleged ministers to the people one way or another, the paradigm is literally broken. And that is one of the most intelligent things I've ever heard said in just a few words, and it is one of the things that has come out of the mouth of the person who has gone through the past 2 hours with me, Mark Windows, windowsontheworld.net. I advise you go over there and check him out. Check out his work, his articles, some of which he referenced tonight. Check out the videos on YouTube if you want, but go to windowsontheworld.net. It's a well-built site and loaded with so much information. You know, if you're not used to it, it may be a bit tough to tackle, so take a few days. Anyway, Mark, thanks once again for joining me here on a Wednesday night. And again, it's just been a privilege to do these presentations with you, because I think we are, at least doing our level best to give people the idea that there is a solution, and that despite the darkness, which we must recognize, we have the ability to turn on the lights and scatter the cockroaches that are trying to feed on us.
That's right, Chuck. Couldn't have put it better myself. Speak to you soon. Next week, I hope. Yeah.
Absolutely. Mark will be back next Wednesday. And of course, the Ochelli Effect will be back tomorrow night. I will have Carmine Savastano and Larry Hancock with me. We're going to get into some historical information of a different sort, but you know, it's all relevant because it's all about how the system has been turned into something that does not serve you, but serves others. And it's not quite what they've always told us. Anyway, appreciate all of you who have tuned in. Appreciate all you guys in the chat room. And, of course, a big thanks to my producer, Tony Hurst, who has done the soldier's job of getting through, dealing with me yet one more night. So take care, everybody. Stay tuned to Ochelli.com stream, or check out other things on the networks that carry us, because, after all, you should support the people that support your right to know the reality. Take care.